They laughed. It started as a ripple at the other end of the table, a low, nervous chuckle that swelled into a chorus of polite, puzzled amusement. Tiffany smiled in that way that made people lean forward. Brian smirked, fork poised like punctuation. They called my house an albatross, my china dust collectors, my garden quaint but impractical. The words were light, the sting was heavy. They told me to let go of the past, Brian said between bites, as if he were offering me soup and the same time a verdict. You don't need this big house, Mom. It's too much. Aren't you tired of stairs? Wouldn't you rather be somewhere smaller, more manageable? He said it like concern. He said it like impatience. At some point, Tiffany reached across and patted my hand. We only want you to be comfortable, she cooed, and the group laughed as if she had told a joke. I could feel the burn in my face, humiliation wrapped in the soft gauze of family dinner. My niece asked where I wanted to retire. My neighbor complimented me on the lemon tart. Nobody noticed that I was turning all those compliments over in my mind like coins, checking them for weight. When the last dish was cleared and a coffee was poured, Brian said it differently, quiet and flat. We sold the house, he told me. You need to pack. You have 24 hours. For a moment, I thought the room tilted. The china clinked. The sound of someone setting down a chair was louder than any words. I kept my hands in my lap. I let him finish. There was a carefulness in his voice I didn't like a person who has practiced saying a thing he expects to be obeyed. I could have let the moment pass. I could have said, "You're exaggerating," or "Stop being dramatic." I thought of how many aunts and cousins would look the other way and say nothing if a family member asked them to. I thought of Tom, my husband, who used to joke that I had the stubbornness of a mule and the patience of a saint. He would have rolled his eyes and said, "Good for you, Maggie. Don't give them the satisfaction." Instead, I sat up straight, put down my coffee cup, and said nothing for a long, private beat. Then I excused myself, walked to my study, and called my lawyer. I paid her that night. If you're watching, tell me which city you're in the comments. I want to see how far this story goes. I will tell you everything, but not as an inventory of legal papers and police reports. I want you to hear the small sounds, the scuff of the moving van on the gravel, the hushed way Tiffany would answer my calls at first, the spring scent of the roses by the mailbox that kept me sitting at my kitchen table long after Tom died. I want you to feel the ordinary life that made the threat so sharp. We'd lived in the Colonial for 37 years. Tom and I planted the magnolia the summer after our first child was born. The house had bones, wide plank floors that creaked in certain places like little secret messages, a foyer window that caught the winter light in a way that made dust look like tiny galaxies. Sunday dinners were our religion. Roast, a salad from the garden, Tom's stale jokes, neighbors who dropped by for pie. The house held everything that mattered. It held the sound of my children laughing as they ran down the hallway. It held Tom's glasses in the drawer where he left them the night he didn't come back. It held my memories thick as wallpaper. And it was also, suddenly, a thing to be negotiated over the kitchen table, like a sofa or a lawnmower. This pressure didn't appear overnight. It moved in slowly, like ivy, starting with helpful suggestions and soft disclaimers. "We worry about you," Brian would say on the phone. "Your knees aren't what they used to be, and that house is a lot." Tiffany would bring casseroles and compliments and a flurry of texts, cute memes about downsizing, links to articles entitled, "Why Less is More After 50." When I answered with a firm, "I like my house," there would be a little silence and then the soothing chorus about safety and ease. They were experts at concern. That's what made it so hard to see at first. There were always the little kindnesses, the lawn mowed, the gutter fixed, and they used them like an anesthetic. They showed up late and left notes. They bought curtains and called me Mom with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. In private, Tiffany repeatedly praised my cooking and my taste. In public, she and Brian found ways to make me the butt of jokes, a quaint, stubborn relic clinging to the past. A week before the dinner they first mentioned downsizing in earnest, Brian had offered to catalog the attic. "We'll take care of the heavy lifting," he'd said, as if he were speaking about a favor. That afternoon, I found a packing slip in the recycling, a reputable moving company, date filled in, a deposit paid with a card I didn't recognize. My stomach lodged itself in my throat. When he told me to pack in 24 hours, that conversation was the culmination of many tiny cuts. But after his flat final statement at the dinner table, something in me changed. It wasn't about pride. It was about clarity. I had been polite for months. I had tolerated the little invasions. but now there was an ultimatum that would actually strip what belonged to me unless I acted. I think a lot of people imagine that older adults are helpless and passive, that we simply drift into the decisions of others. That hurt goes in both directions, because I had been careful all my life, meticulous with paperwork, faithful with friends, stubborn about my independence. I do not think that makes me immune. It makes me more dangerous to someone who hopes to move quietly. I drove to my lawyer's office that night with the smell of lemon and cinnamon from the tart still under my fingernails. Sarah Morrison opened her office door, already in her sweater, hair swept up in that practical twist she wears when she means business. I told her everything in a rush that left out nothing and spared nothing. I told her about the packing slip I'd found, about the cash-like sense with which Tiffany and Brian had slowly rearranged themselves into my life, about the text messages that read like love notes but landed like orders. I told her what Brian had said at dinner. Sarah listened. She did not blink. When I finished, she sat back and said, "Good. We'll stop them." We put a retainer on her credit card that night. I remember the sound of the machine, the small beep, the paper whispering. It felt like a tiny, private purchase of my future, a fee for someone who understood trust law and who wasn't afraid to stand up in a courtroom. I slept badly. I woke earlier than usual, not with fear, but with a kind of readiness I had not felt since Tom's funeral. There was work to be done. The next morning, she came out to the house. She walked the rooms the way someone might read a ledger, noting where the windows opened, where the locks were, how the foyer light worked. She sat at my kitchen table with a stack of documents and asked me simple, precise questions. Who was on the deed? Who had keys? Who handled the utilities? She made lists. She scribbled, the way a person makes a map toward safety. The first thing she did was check the county records. That was where the truth hid in black and white. When we walked into the clerk's office, the woman behind the counter recognized Sarah's name and nodded the way professionals do when they meet someone they know to be steady. The document said what I already suspected. The house was in a living trust, created years ago when Tom and I were planning for the inevitable small practicalities of age. I was the trustee. I had authority, in writing. It should have been a relief. It was a relief and a challenge at once. A living trust means the property doesn't move without the trustee's consent. It means it's not something you can sell by fiat in the kitchen. But a document on paper is only as strong as your willingness to defend it when the people closest to you decide to ignore it. Back at the house, Sarah asked if I would be willing to document everything. She said the words the way I'd imagined Tom would say them, not because he was an attorney, but because he trusted quiet, steady preparation. Take everything in the attic down and inventory it. Set a drawer of mail aside. Make copies of your statements. If you have a camera, put it over the front door. We need to make sure there's a trail. I didn't know how to argue with that. I found an old digital camera in a kitchen drawer and mounted it above the front door like a new sentinel. Helen and Clara from the book club came by with boxes and sandwiches. They brought laughter and they brought Webster's for cross-referencing. They sat on my porch and read aloud the names on the deed like incantations, and in their voices were the small, fierce sounds of people who would not let their friend be taken. There's a particular kind of cowardice that shows itself in layers. Brian's most effective tactic was that he wrapped his greed in concern. He would speak in terms of "for your good" until it made people uncomfortable to oppose him. When the moving company showed up 2 days later, a white van with a company name and a courteous driver who smiled too brightly, Sarah told me to let them knock. She wanted them on my terms. She wanted them to be the ones to produce their paperwork. They knocked early with a work order folded neatly in their folder. The driver told the same story everyone does when they're asked to describe a sensitive job. We were contracted by the homeowner's son. They said it like it was official, like the word homeowner was a talisman that made whatever they were doing legal. The man handed over a bill of lading, a copy of the deposit, a phone number for the person who had hired them. The handwriting looked like Brian's. Sarah called them on it. She asked for identification, for the contract, for proof of authorization. She kept her voice steady and the kind of polite formality that strips away pretense. While she spoke, I stood on the porch and watched the driver's smile harden into annoyance. Tiffany, who had come with him, fluttered at the edge of the yard, eyebrows plucked and eyes bright as if to show she belonged to no harm. Another tactic, surround intimidation with appearances. When the driver realized the paperwork said contracted by the homeowner's son, but the living trust listed me as the only trustee, He looked past the legalese into something else. His expression was the expression of someone who has been made to choose between a paycheck and a principle. He chose the paycheck. The van left with less than it had planned. Some boxes, it turned out, had already been loaded from an earlier visit in the week. Sarah photographed every receipt on the table, logged the license plate, and told the driver she would be in touch. Walking back into the house was like stepping into a small victory that was both public and private. I had not stormed their van or shouted or made a scene. I had let the law and the documentation do the work I couldn't let my anger do. Still, that night the neighbor's young gardener asked, "Are you all right?" And I realized I didn't know how to answer without sounding like someone who thinks the world of their own house. Because it isn't only the law that saves you, it's the people who notice. It's neighbors who notice a van not leaving with as many boxes as expected. It's friends who will drive across town to sit in your living room and sort the attic. It's the clerk who looks up from the counter and recognizes your lawyer's name. The presence of those people makes the difference between a quiet theft and an act that must be explained. Evidence, I learned, is a kind of gentle bulldozer. It moves with time and momentum. A credit card statement can be so ordinary you don't notice it. A small transaction in an account buried between monthly car payments and a routine grocery bill. But if you look closely, the dots start to line up. Sarah asked me for my bank records, and I spent an afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, the dog-eared ledger open, matching numbers to dates. On one line was a charge far outside our normal life, a hotel reservation, a resort booking in the Maldives listed under Tiffany's name. There was a deposit on the moving company that matched the date of that packing slip I'd found in the recycling. I called Robert Chen. He was Brian's colleague from the firm where he had worked until last year. He admitted over the phone, with the careful voice of someone trying not to be dragged into family matters, that Brian had been taking loans against anything that would float. He was always in a hurry, Robert said. He's been in trouble for some time. Robert's confirmation didn't surprise me so much as sharpen the picture. It turned motive into a simple arithmetic problem. Someone who needs money is more likely to try to convert things into cash, and a big house is an easy conversion if the people around you are willing to sign away your authority or to make it seem like you have never had it. It was around then that they tried another approach. Dr. Patricia Henshaw came to the house with a letter and a gentle manner. She spoke in pastels and probabilities, and the sort of clinical compassion that sounds like an accusation dressed in velvet. "Mrs. Sanderson," she said, taking my hand too gently in a way that made my skin prickle, "we have concerns about your safety. Have you been forgetful? Do you find it difficult to manage your finances? I have never been a person who enjoyed defending my mind like a prized possession, but I will not have my competence questioned casually." I answered each of her questions with exactness. I gave dates. I recited the medications I take. I remembered the name of an obscure cousin who had once worked in the same hospital where Dr. Henshaw once trained, and I could see her notes shifting the way a person rearranges priorities. Sarah had anticipated Dr. Henshaw. She had already sent a letter requesting any medical evaluation be forwarded to our office, and warning that any attempt to seek guardianship without concrete evidence of incapacity would be vigorously opposed. There's a thing about paperwork. It can say, gently but definitively, that you are not to be messed with. Nevertheless, the arrival of Dr. Henshaw signaled a new phase. When people cannot convince you with charm, they try to convince courts with authority. Tiffany's voicemail pacing shifted from warmth to a kind of urgency. There were more flowers, and also more insistence. "We only want what's best," she said. "We don't want to see you hurt." All the while, my friends from the book club, Helen, Clara, Patricia, kept coming. Helen brought a tray of lemon bars and a stack of old receipts she had organized into labeled envelopes. Clara sat on the edge of the sofa and transcribed my calendar. Patricia drove to the library and printed a list of neighborhood caretakers who could be witnesses to the times I had been alone and perfectly capable. Their presence made a difference. They testified informally to my competence in a way that the law recognizes in its own messy human way, as reputation, as character, as proof that life is not empty of meaning when someone says it is. Sarah started compiling a file: the trust document, the moving company's bill of lading, the hotel charge, bank statements, the photograph of the driver's license, the witness statements from neighbors, the screenshots of Tiffany's social media posts that celebrated a needed getaway. She labeled everything with dates and notes. The file began to look like a story you could hand to a judge and say, "This is what happened." There were small, sharp moments that made the stakes feel very present.
I received a phone call one evening from a woman whose voice I did not recognize. "Is Margaret Sanderson there?" she asked. It turned out to be an agent from the movers who wanted to know whether we were okay. It was a small kindness, but I felt a shock of gratitude. The moving company's driver had called to tell them that something had felt off about taking boxes from my house. He told the dispatcher the papers didn't match the trustee, and the dispatcher had called to confirm I was safe. I replayed that night in my head like a miniature miracle: a stranger with a conscience, a clerk who read the document carefully, friends who preserved my afternoons for proof. None of it was supernatural. It was human, messy, sincere, and enough. One evening, after the sun had gilded the magnolia and set a golden rim around everything, Brian came by with a quietness that would have been charming if it weren't so calculated. He told me he'd been worried about me, that he only wanted to help. He said the kind of sentence meant to soften you before a blow. "Mom, we're not doing this to be cruel." There was an appeal in his voice to family loyalty that tasted like old bread, familiar, stale, comforting if you let yourself believe. I met him in the kitchen. He handed me a packet with the moving company's logo on it, and a note that looked like it might be from the company, but had a line that caught my eye: "For the convenience of Mrs. Sanderson's family." I asked him where he had gotten the money to put down on the moving company. He said he had used a credit card and that everything had been arranged with Tiffany's help. I asked him directly if the house had been sold.
He hesitated, and then he said what every manipulative person says when their pattern is exposed: "We're trying to protect you from making a mistake." I said, calmly, because fury can be wasted on the wrong things, "Brian, the trust lists me as trustee. That's not a mistake. That's a legal document." He was silent for a long time, and the silence was a kind of confession. He looked at me the way a thief might look at an alarmed house after the alarm has been set off. For the first time in months, I saw an expression on his face that was not smooth or rehearsed, but raw and unguarded. It was, in a way, the thing I had been waiting for, the moment when the truth clears itself of niceties. That night I did more small, stubborn things. I scanned the packets and sent them to Sarah. I cataloged every voicemail. I set up a little digital folder called Evidence and saved everything there like a careful librarian. I called Linda Martinez at Adult Protective Services and left a message asking what their process was for reports of potential financial exploitation. I did not file a report. I was still gathering, still making sure my story was more than suspicion. They did not stop. In the space between our actions and theirs, they tried to shore up their narrative. Tiffany began a campaign of calls beginning with an odd, shrill cheerfulness that I can still hear when I close my eyes. "How are you, Mom?" she would sing through the phone. "We are just worried about you." The concern was a bandage for a bruise. When the next moving truck appeared in our street, Sarah insisted we document it. She called the police non-emergency line and requested a courtesy check because of the prior activity. We recorded the episode, capturing the driver's identity, the license plate number, and the order form that matched the deposit I'd found in the recycling. Tiffany lingered on the porch like a disappointed actress. Brian lingered, then left abruptly when he saw the cameras. You learn in these moments how even ordinary bureaucracy can become your ally. A photocopy here, a notarized statement there, means that when someone later tries to tell a story of your confusion, you have pages and dates to offer in response. I began to enjoy, in a small, stubborn way, the act of cataloging my own life. It felt like reclaiming parts of it from an energetic fog. Still, as we built the file and tightened our defenses, there was a kind of cruel theater playing out in my living room. That evening, after another of those syrupy phone calls from Tiffany, I sat with Helen while she read out a letter from Sarah. "We are preparing to defend Mrs. Sanderson's interests," Helen read, voice steady. "Please forward any medical evaluations to us. Any further attempts to remove Mrs. Sanderson from the property without proper authority will be met with immediate legal action." Someone knocked at the door in the middle of that recitation. I opened it because I always do.
And there on my stoop were two men in dark jackets who introduced themselves as from a local elder services organization. They had a clipboard and badges, and they spoke of wellness checks and community resources. I invited them in because the world is polite, and because sometimes aid appears in little surprising packages. They asked about my social activities. They asked whether I drove alone. They asked if I had a friend who brought me supper. I named Helen and Clara and Patricia. They took notes. I let them stay long enough to see they were not part of Brian's plan. They were there because someone in the neighborhood had called that morning after seeing the moving van. They were there because the woman in the moving company with a guilty conscience had made a phone call. Neighborhood eyes are an underappreciated form of protection. By the time the sun set that day, the evidence file had weight. Sarah told me to breathe. She told me that what we had was not dramatic, but real, a pattern of behavior consistent with exploitation. She used the word motive, like a careful surgeon would use a scalpel. She cautioned me that this is not the sort of thing that always moves quickly, that sometimes the legal system is slow and clumsy and makes you wait in a corridor while people shuffle pages. We did not have to wait in silence. We began to prepare our witnesses. Helen would testify to her visits and the way Brian had come by when the garden was in bloom. The moving company dispatcher would confirm the inward friction of conscience in his staff. Robert Chen would speak to Brian's financial desperation if contacted. Sarah explained in plain language what a judge would look for: proof of incapacity, proof of manipulation, the chain of transactions that tied motive to action. There was, too, the softer work of reclaiming my life. I started going to book club more regularly, not to collect allies, but because we had always loved our weekly discussions. They were medicine of their own kind, a place where my complaints could be simple, where the conversation would turn from property documents to passages in novels about women who refused to be small. I began to sleep with the bedroom window cracked open, the magnolia's fragrance filling the room at dusk. And I took the dog for longer walks, not because it was a chore, but because I liked the way the town looked in the evening, like a painting someone had just finished. Yet there was an undercurrent of menace that did not go away. The day after the moving van incident, Tiffany sent an email implying that my neighbors were overreacting. She suggested, to an audience that included my cousin and my sister-in-law, that perhaps I was taking myself too seriously. The attempt to gaslight was obvious enough to make my skin crawl. Rewrite the narrative so that you, the person whose life is threatened, are the unreasonable one.
When Sarah saw the email, she said, "They want to normalize their conduct by making your reactions seem hysterical." She explained why that makes sense. If the people around you start to doubt your reactions, the exploiters have more room to move. So we gathered not just documents, but credibility. We collected calendars and receipts and written statements from people who had seen us not just as a client, but as a friend. There were moments of absurdity that kept me from becoming bitter. Once, Tiffany mailed me a box of hand-knit socks with a note thanking me for all the wisdom and stories. The box smelled faintly of lavender. I put the socks aside and laughed with Helen at the tea next week, as if the socks could be a parody of everything. And then there was the other edge, that washing machine moment when you realize someone close to you may do something you cannot forgive. I remember standing in the hallway one late night, listening to the house settle, and whispering into my phone to no one in particular, "What do you do when your child becomes someone who would take your home?" I felt the grief like a weight in my chest, but grief in those early nights never had the last word. We began to lay the groundwork for a formal defense. Sarah wrote letters to the moving company and to Dr. Henshaw requesting records. She did not slander, she requested. She did not accuse, she sought documents. That was the line between righteous anger and the slow, necessary machinery of law. One late afternoon, as the light filtered through the magnolia and the house hummed with small domestic sounds, I found a piece of paper tucked between the pages of an old cookbook, a list of places Tom and I had once considered retiring to when the children were small. I read it and felt an odd peace. People forget that in fighting to keep something, you also discover what truly belongs to you beyond the bricks and boards. The house was, in many ways, a ledger of a life well tended. Protecting it felt less like clinging and more like honoring. But the other side was not idle. I could feel the pressure like a tide. The calls increased, the bouquets multiplied. There were moments when neighbors would tell me they saw Tiffany driving by slowly in the mornings, as if checking whether the blinds were open. She started attending community events where I was present, always smiling, always eager to be photographed next to me, as if to prove to anyone who would see that their presence in my life was a kindly one. I had long thought the only thing worse than being betrayed by a stranger was being betrayed by someone you loved. And yet, betrayal by family is not a single moment. It is a series of small decisions you collect until they change the map of your life. What made this different was that I refused to be a passive recipient of those decisions. I chose to respond. We did not know at that point whether Brian and Tiffany would move to petition for guardianship.
We suspected it. They had rallied the language of concern and arranged for a clinician to visit. But suspicion is not proof. That's why evidence matters. You can speak fiercely at a dinner table and make people uncomfortable. You can also quietly assemble a dossier that answers each claim with a date and a document and a witness. The weeks that followed were a study in patience and of being methodical. I recorded the time each unexpected visitor arrived. I made copies of letters and put them in an envelope labeled correspondence. I ordered security footage from a neighbor's camera that had captured the moving van's plate. I took Sarah's advice about what to do, and did it, not because I loved forms, but because I loved the logic of defense. Each piece of paper felt small and significant at the same time, like a stitch in a larger fabric that would, if done right, hold. And then, one morning, a plain envelope arrived on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a document that looked like a draftsman's note, a rough attempt to create a sense of authority. It suggested that my son had the right to assist me in the management of my affairs. It was unsigned, it was unnotarized. It was useless as legal paperwork, and yet menacing because it implied plans being made in the dark. When I showed it to Sarah, she smiled in that way she gets before she rolls up her sleeves. "We'll catalog this too," she said. "Useless documents can be as revealing as forged ones." She photographed it and added it to the folder. The folder was becoming an atlas of intent. By then, the town had started to hum with small, sympathetic interest. Our mail carrier would raise an eyebrow and ask if I needed anything brought in. The woman who runs the pharmacy had me designated as trusted in her system so that if anyone called with questions about medication, she could alert me directly. It was, in a quiet way, heartening to see how a community can become a shield when someone decides to be vigilant. One night, I sat at my kitchen table and tuned the radio to a classical station. The news bulletin mentioned a local charity hosting a fundraiser for elderly independence. I thought of how Tom and I used to joke about plastering our names in the back of programs, and of the ways people try to make a difference. I thought of the small foundation Sarah had once mentioned, and how when this was over I might want to do something similar, so that someone else would not stand alone as I had. There were also darker practicalities. Sarah said we might need to prepare for an aggressive move: guardianship petitions, claims of diminished capacity, affidavits from professionals. She explained the steps a judge would take in plain language. We discussed how to present myself: clear, coherent, composed. We practiced a few questions for the possibility of a formal evaluation. I learned how to answer, briefly and firmly, where I live, what I do, when I pay my bills.
It felt like rehearsing for a performance, except the performance was truth. It is strange to prepare to prove your own competence. You practice your days like a script. I manage my medications. I pay my utilities. I oversee my finances. You say it until the words lose their edges, and then you say them again, because language is the only tool you have to make a judge see you sitting at your kitchen table, smelling the magnolia, and not as an abstraction to be decided upon by papers and surrogates. Then one afternoon, as the autumn light was beginning to tinge the leaves, Sarah called and asked if I could come to her office. My first thought was that there was a new development. I dressed in a sweater I liked and drove into town. She met me at her desk with a small stack of papers and a clarity in her voice that made my stomach do the familiar flip. "We have enough here to challenge any premature petition," she said. "We've got documents that show the money trail, witnesses who will confirm your routine, and material contradictions in their narrative. But you must be prepared for the next move. They may try for an emergency guardianship, and when that happens, we will respond quickly." At that moment, the ordinary pace of my life felt both dangerously close to normal and painfully precarious. I had spent 3 decades making a home, and suddenly that work stood on a knife edge. But I felt, too, an odd thread of exhilaration, not at their trouble, but at my own capacity to hold a line. When I left Sarah's office, I drove past the little park where Tom and I had met. The bench under the big oak tree looked unchanged, but I saw it through a different light. To protect a life is to make a decision that you will not let others dictate your mapping of the future. It is to read the trust and the deed with reverence and tenacity. It is to say, "This is mine, and I will defend it." That night, I folded letters into envelopes, wrote a list of witnesses, and made another cup of tea. Outside, the magnolia leaves whispered against the window. I lay awake thinking about the dinner table and the way their laughter had sounded that night. Easy, cruel, satisfied. The memory of Tiffany's hand on my arm stayed like a bruise. I did not imagine that what I had started with a paid retainer and a stack of notarized papers would be easy. I only knew it was right. The law had become a tool that could carve out space for my dignity. And that knowledge, more than anything else, kept me awake with a steady, indignant hope. It was then, as I was closing the file and setting my pen beside it, that the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I did not recognize. I answered without thinking. "Mrs. Sanderson?" a voice said in a voice that was at once official and casual. "This is from the county clerk. There has been an emergency filing. You should be aware that there is a petition pending." For a moment, the sound of the word petition made the room tilt. Then, like a hand on a tiller, I felt a clarity come back. "Tell me the details,"
I said. My voice was steady. I had Sarah, I had witnesses, I had a file. I had paid a lawyer that night. That, more than anything, was the truth that guided me forward. The petition is filed, Sarah said over the phone, calm and exact as always, the kind of voice that makes you feel the edges of panic rounding off into something workable. They've asked for an emergency guardianship hearing. We need to move quickly. Moving quickly meant the kind of preparation that has no glamour, notarizing affidavits, photocopying bank statements until my hands ached, printing screenshots and dating them, calling witnesses and asking them to come to court and to be ready to speak plainly. It meant practicing how to answer a judge without sounding like you were reciting a script, and it meant convincing a room full of strangers that the life you've lived is intact and worth defending. The courtroom smelled like paper and old polish. The seats were a hard, institutional green. People moved with that cross between reverence and impatience that only the law can manufacture. James Kirkland, who had the neat, confident hymns of a man used to short-cutting questions, stood to the side with a folder and a watchful expression. Brian sat close to Tiffany, his face thinner than it had been at dinner, the edge of shame mixed with a bruised arrogance. They looked like people who had rehearsed being right and now found that rehearsals have gaps. Judge Patricia Carmichael walked in with the kind of presence that makes a room quiet, as if someone has dimmed the lights. She gloved her comments in evenness. You had to listen because she didn't shout. Sarah rose and moved with the steady economy her person who has argued for years, a person who doesn't need to fill silence with noise. She lets the facts do the talking. I sat with my hands folded, feeling at once both exposed and armored, because the folder on my lap contained a year's worth of proof. The petition read like a neat, sympathetic tale. Concern, a clinician's note, the claim that an older adult might be vulnerable and in need of a guardian to manage her affairs. Legal words can be gentle. They can also be tools. They brought Dr. Patricia Henshaw to the stand. She had the soft, practiced manner of a clinician and the kind of vocabulary that translates uncertainty into medical concern. She described brief observations, slightly slowed recall on certain questions, a hesitation when asked the date of a recent appointment, and she said politely that in her professional opinion, there were indicators that warranted protection. Her tone was careful. It sounded like charity. Sarah's cross-examination was surgical and at the same time humane. She asked about the extent of Dr. Henshaw's evaluation, a half-hour visit at a kitchen table, notes taken on a pad, no cognitive battery performed, no corroborating tests.
She pointed out that the doctor had not reviewed medical records, had not spoken to my regular physician, and had based much of her impression on a single, brief conversation. For a moment, the doctor's calm faltered. The thin web of authority wavered under a closer light. Then Sarah shifted the focus, as she had the right to do. She introduced the bank records, the utility payments done on time, the check to the electrician last summer, the regular grocery cards run in the name of Margaret Sanderson, not some proxy. She produced the moving company's bill of lading, with its deposit date and the Maldives booking under Tiffany's name. She presented the dispatcher's record, the man at the moving company who had called to say something felt off, who had logged the job but then flagged it to his supervisor. The narrative they had sculpted between them, motive and method, began to show seams. It became my turn. I had thought about how I would speak to a judge for weeks. I had practiced tone and brevity. I had practiced not letting indignation carry me away, though it sometimes wanted to. I talked about my days, the volunteer shifts at the library where I sorted donations twice a month, the garden club where I coordinated the plant swap, the neighbors who knew my habit of walking the dog at 6, the bills I paid online each month, and the checks I still wrote to Helen for her patience and helping me with insurance forms. I described how I pay attention to the detail of life because attention matters when you live alone. Judge Carmichael asked questions with the precise interest of someone who wanted to make a decision that would affect a life. She asked me directly whether I could manage my finances, whether I had been coerced, whether I understood the implications of a guardianship. I answered, not proudly but plainly, yes, I manage my finances, yes, I understand, and no, I had not given anyone authority to sell the house. When she asked why I had not reported any oddities sooner, I told the truth. I had been trying to keep the peace, and sometimes that meant giving away small things to keep the larger calm, but I had kept records. I had taken evidence seriously once I suspected a plan. Sarah called witnesses who knew the ordinary facts of my life. Helen testified to cups of tea and to receipts. She could say, without drama, that I had mailed a check for a roof repair 3 months prior, and that I had accompanied her to the library on a Thursday morning.
Clara spoke about the calendar she had kept. Patricia corroborated the times I had called to meet friends. Robert Chen, Brian's colleague, spoke to Brian's financial instability in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who didn't want to be involved but could not lie. The moving company dispatcher described the call he had received from his driver, the note of discomfort when the driver realized the paperwork did not match the person who legally controlled the property.
James Kirkland attempted to weave an account of concern, a son alarmed by the responsibilities, and a well-intentioned daughter-in-law who only wanted care. He asked gentle questions about my occasional forgetfulness, about the fact that sometimes I misplaced a key or left the stove on. Those small moments were not omitted. We had accounted for them. What mattered was the pattern and the preparation. The judge had to decide whether a temporary handover of power was justified by a risk of imminent harm, not whether I had the occasional hint of human fallibility that comes with long living. The arguments at their most precise turned on two simple things: authority and motive. A living trust, a clear, properly recorded trust with me as trustee, was a legal boundary. It gave me the authority to control transfer. Motive was in the deposits and the bookings and the quiet patterns of pressure. If the court could see both the legal framework and the human incentives, then it could deny a rushed intervention. Judge Carmichael listened, and she also read the files. There is a weight in the way a judge can scan paper and see patterns without melodrama. When she spoke, she named the elements she had considered: the clinician's limited assessment, the bank and transaction records, the chain of custody of documents, the testimony of neighbors and professionals, and the existence of the living trust. Her voice was even. There was no triumph in it, only the gravity of someone wielding responsibility. She denied the emergency guardianship petition. That phrase, when she said it, sounded almost like a sound you can feel through the floor. Denied. Not approved. Not temporary control. Denied. She ordered that Brian and Tiffany not execute any transfers or conveyances without my explicit consent. She ordered the moving company to produce all records and directed the county clerk to copy everything to Adult Protective Services to review for potential exploitation. And this I had not asked for, but which felt like a small rebalancing. She ordered that the petitioners contribute to a portion of my legal fees, given the demonstrable weight of their filings and the evidence of motive. It did not feel like vengeance. It felt like something more sober, a refusal to allow a private betrayal to be legitimized by a court. It was, in small letters and decisions, a recognition that the law is one place where the dignity of an elder can be affirmed when human relationships fail. Outside the courthouse, the air tasted like a late spring that had not yet settled. People who had sat with me in the small green seats shook my hand and looked me in the eye, as if to confirm that the person they had listened to was real and whole. Sarah folded her jacket over one arm and said simply, "We did what we needed to do." Her voice held no exultation, only an acknowledgement of duty done. The referral to Adult Protective Services set a different clock in motion.
They contacted me within days, and an investigator named Linda Martinez, the woman whose number I had called in the early weeks, arrived with a professional warmth. She was practical and thorough. She asked the questions a neutral party asks, and took notes in that way that turns memory into a public record. She told me she would look into financial records and interview the involved parties. Her presence felt like someone in the system choosing to pay attention. In the weeks that followed, the effects of public scrutiny nudged consequences into action. Brian's employer placed him on administrative leave pending an internal review when they were contacted by reporters and by the company's own compliance office alerted to the complaint. Tiffany's social visibility decreased. Invitations that had once arrived began to thin. I learned through once-in-a-while neighbors that the mortgage company on their small home had begun sending notices when payments were missed. These were not legal penalties imposed by a judge. These were consequences set in motion by a mixture of paper and reputation. When people see a pattern, institutions respond. I am not one to revel in another person's difficulty, even someone who had harmed me, but consequences can be the corrective that a system needs. They were not meant to punish me into feeling better. They were meant to keep others from being harmed in the future. After the courtroom, life required repair that was both practical and tender. The house had small wounds, a scuff where a moving dolly had been placed in a hurry, a cracked stair banister where a box had been dragged, a back fence with a slat loosened by the van's bumper. We fixed each thing. I repainted the bathroom in a pale blue that made the light softer. I replaced Tom's old armchair cushion, even though I knew the faded shape of him shut into it like a memory.
Repair can be ritual. It can be a way of reasserting that you take up space and that your space matters. Friends rallied not with heroics but with constancy. The book club met in my living room and argued, in deliciously civilized ways, over themes in a novel. Helen brought over lemon bars in a folder labeled support. Clara organized a small schedule to help with errands. Patricia volunteered to teach a class at the community center on how to keep a simple household ledger. The gestures were mundane, and because they were mundane, they were sustaining. It was around this time that David appeared in my life in a way that had nothing to do with the drama we had just endured. He is a retired professor who came to a talk at the library about local history and wound up later sitting at my table because someone mentioned my magnolia. He has a quiet laugh and a way of listening that seems to gather words up and make them safe.
We began walking the dog together, first with careful politeness, and then with the kind of ease that comes when two people realize they enjoy one another's company without needing to prove anything. I did not mention David to the judge. Courtrooms are not the places for small personal joys. They are the places for facts and measures. But there is a dignity in letting yourself continue to have life beyond the fight. Affection is not the absence of scars. It is the presence of softness you choose to keep. There was one decision I made that surprised some people and which surprised me too. When the dust settled enough for me to think clearly about the long term, I decided not to pursue a reconciliatory path with Brian and Tiffany, not because I wanted to erase them, but because I had to be honest about what safety looked like for me. I extended boundaries with clarity, limited contact, no unilateral access to the house, and written agreements about what would happen when we attended family events. Boundaries are neither revenge nor simple cruelty. They are the architecture of self-preservation. The experience also changed what I wanted my life to mean going forward. I thought about the small acts that had made a difference for me: a neighbor who noticed a van, a moving company dispatcher who felt conscience prick, a lawyer who understood trust law, a book club who came and sorted attic boxes like a quiet army. I wanted that ripple to be larger. With Sarah's counsel and friends' urging, I began the process of creating a small foundation. It would not be a vast charitable organization. It would be a focused effort. Workshops at community centers that taught older adults how to organize basic documents, volunteer programs to check in with seniors living alone, and a modest fund for emergency legal consultations when someone suspected a predatory action. We set up the paperwork carefully, with clear bylaws and a small, honest budget. It felt, in its own way, like the day I wrote checks for the lawn service, an act of tending. I also started giving talks. At the library and at the community center, I would stand before a small crowd and recount how evidence and community had been the tools that saved me. I told them not to be afraid of forms. I said that a ledger is not a sign of paranoia, but of care. I was careful to avoid offering legal instructions. I described only what we had done and why each piece of paper mattered. People listened with the kind of attention that feels like a promise, that they would take note and protect those they loved. The Foundation's first workshop was modestly attended, 16 people and 2 volunteers, but it felt like planting the first row of a garden. We handed out folders and showed how to organize a living trust, how to keep a calendar of visitors, how to document transactions.
We practiced the sort of plain phrases one could say to a judge. I pay my bills. I manage my appointments. I live here and I make my decisions. We did not promise legal invincibility. We offered tools and the company of neighbors. Beyond institutional steps, there was a private work of reclaiming joy. I redid the garden along the front walk, planting lavender, and replacing the elderly boxwood with perennials that would return softer each spring. I learned to make a lemon tart that came out with a perfect golden top. I filled the house again with the sounds that had always mattered: a kettle that sang when the water boiled, the soft turning of pages, laughter that had returned to the table. Occasionally, I would see Brian across the street, or hear news that he had lost a client, or had been dismissed from a position. I will not pretend I felt no sorrow. I did. Grief for what had been, for the child who once rode on my shoulders and laughed without calculation, is not erased by lawful remedies. But there is a difference between sorrow and compliance. I chose to protect my life. I did not confuse that with cruelty. I continued my friendship with Sarah in ways that were quieter than the court files. Over the months, she became the kind of friend you can call when you need to find a color for a room, or when you want someone to come and taste the lemon bars.
The legal work had been critical, yes, but what steadied me afterward was the ordinary attentions of people who knew the difference between professional duty and human kindness. The case concluded not with fireworks, but with a quiet wrapping up. Adult Protective Services filed a report and made recommendations. Their investigation confirmed irregularities in some of the transactions and recommended further inquiry by financial institutions. The record of their involvement became part of the municipal record that might help others later. I never wanted to put my name at the center of a civic conversation, but if my experience could help even one neighbor notice an oddity and act, then the public part of my life had paid off. People ask me sometimes whether I forgave. Forgiveness is a private and complicated thread. For me, the necessary thing was not forgiveness so much as clear boundaries and the decision to live a life that kept me safe and open in measured ways. I wanted my days to be filled with choices I made, not the choices others made for me. There were lessons that felt like bones beneath the skin of the story. 1. Documentation matters. The paper trail we kept, the living trust, the receipts, the moving company's deposit, the hotel charge under Tiffany's name, the dispatcher's note, created the map that showed motive. 2. You are not alone if you accept help. The professionals, neighbors, friends, and strangers who noticed made a difference. 3. Agency can be reclaimed at any age, but reclaiming it is active work. It needs paperwork and preparation as well as courage.
I returned often in my mind to the night at the dinner table when they mocked me and told me to let go. That night, I had paid the lawyer. It was a small, decisive purchase, not expensive in golf club terms, but a strategic expense that bought me representation and, more importantly, action. The fee was a turning point, not because money fixed everything, but because it signaled that I would not surrender quietly. It announced that I would meet coercion with paper and witnesses and the kind of tedious consistency that law prefers. In the months and years that followed, the house remained mine. We kept the trust in place and worked to simplify my estate plans with a focus on clarity and accessibility. The foundation we started never became a multi-million-dollar operation. It did become a steady resource in our town, a meeting place where we taught simple practices and where neighbors volunteered to check in on those who asked for support. Once, at a community event, a woman in the back of the room stood and told me a story that echoed mine. She had also been pushed by a relative and had felt the same humiliation at a family gathering. She had seen my name in a local article and had come to the workshop. She told me in a voice that suggested relief that she had filed a list of possessions and copies of a trust with her attorney that week. "I thought about you at dinner," she said. "You made me think I could do something." There is a strange kind of grace in that, to find your pain transformed into someone else's precaution. It does not remove what you suffered, but it makes the suffering hold meaning beyond itself. The work we did allowed neighbors to become more watchful and to think of documents as instruments of dignity rather than paranoia. People sometimes ask whether I regret the family ties that frayed. I do not regret the tireless commitment I had to a life I made. I do not relish the fracture, but I also refuse to romanticize a relationship that tried to strip me of my home. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal of the past, it is a stewardship of the future. At night, when the magnolia scent comes through the window and the house creaks in familiar places, I think of that dinner table again. I feel the heat of shame that first night, the sharp private burn of being laughed at by people you love. I also remember the small, steady sound of the card machine beeping as I paid Sarah that night. The two sounds belong together in the story. One, the moment you are exposed, the other, the moment you choose to act. If there is one final thing I would offer, it is this. Dignity has practical requirements. It needs paper and people, and the willingness to ask for help. It needs the stubbornness of a woman who knows the shape of her life and will not watch it be repackaged while she sleeps. It needs neighbors who notice, and a clerk who recognizes a lawyer's name and has the professional courtesy to nod. And sometimes it needs a retainer paid in the small hours when humiliation is still hot and you are deciding whether to let a thing happen or to stop it. They mocked me at that family dinner and they expected me to fold. Instead, I paid the lawyer that night. I do not tell you this to boast. I tell you this because the decision to act, even a small, urgent one, can change the course of a life. If my story reaches you, and you think of someone who might need a steady hand, tell me which city you're in the comments. Let us see how far this kind of story travels. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself and protecting what belongs to you. Sharing helps others know they are not alone.